Great, thank you, Jenna. Hi, everyone. Really glad to be here today, sharing and listening to everyone. So my presentation is called Finding Purpose by Focusing on Student Agency. So as you can see from the title, I was really trying to reflect on that call for papers about finding purpose. So what I want to talk about here is how, for me personally, this has kind of worked as a researcher, looking for purpose, again, connecting that to focusing on student agency. So I think generally the point of view I've taken is talking about from research perspective, but I hope it also can apply to other ways of working with international students that other people may be engaged in. And also should say, as I kind of framed it there, this is kind of what's worked for me. I don't mean to imply it would work for everyone or it's universal, but maybe there's ideas that others can draw from what I can share here. So there it is. Okay, so first kind of question to think about is why focus on student agency? And I think probably I don't have to convince people here that it's a good thing to do to focus on student agency, but I do think it's good to try to articulate what we mean when we say that. And so I came up with some ideas for kind of what it means for me. So one thing I think we do talk about a lot is it's a way to challenge deficit narratives. So when we focus on agency, we really, for me, focus on student resources and what they bring to whatever they're doing, and definitely not what they're missing, which is what those deficit narratives typically highlight. And the second one, kind of overlapping, is I think focusing on agency helps us move away from these homogenizing one-dimensional discourses. So I think that agency can happen in very different ways for different people and for different individuals and for different communities. So I think automatically, if we're focusing on how students do their agency, what that means for them, we're already sort of offering insights that are unique and individual. They're not just sort of this broad imagined category of international students. Third and fourth, kind of overlapping. So the first one, focus on agency just promotes appreciation for students' autonomy. I think especially talking about college students, and those are the students that I work with, these are adults and we need to respect their autonomy. That goes for all students, by the way, not just international students. And the last one about fostering respect for our students. I feel like I shouldn't even have to write that or number 3, but I think sometimes we do need to draw attention to that. And we know it's not always there. So I think when we do this kind of work, part of what we do is kind of model and ideally promote certain ways of thinking about students. So all these things I have here, the ultimate goal is it does something positive for international students, and that's where the focus should be. I think what it does generally, these are all ways to sort of reframe, offer a different lens for thinking about international students. And that's where the focus should be. But what I want to kind of highlight here is that I think there's also like a positive side effect that can happen for researchers when we do this kind of work, and that's that it can also help researchers find purpose in what we're doing. And again, to me, that's like a secondary thing. The main thing are those bullet points and many other things we could add there. But I think it also has some other positive effects that are good and that we should pay attention to. So what I want to do in the next couple of slides is try to describe how I think this process happens. And then after that, give an example of one example where this has happened for me. So again, I was thinking about reflecting on the idea of finding purpose. And that led me partly to think about how the word purpose kind of seems to connect to goals. So when we feel we have purpose, it's often because we have a clear sense of goals that we're trying to pursue. And when we're pursuing goals, it seems to me we're enacting agency, we're doing something agentive. So these 3 terms to me all kind of overlap with one another. And I was trying to just think maybe there's like a linear relationship. That's kind of how I have it here with these arrows, like one leads to the next, leads to the other. But I really actually think it's probably not that simple, or I don't know how to describe it in those terms anyway. So I just kind of set it up like this. So I think all 3 of these terms are somehow overlapping, somehow they coexist, they influence one another. Maybe if you have 1 or 2, you also have the third. But I'm not really sure that it starts with purpose, or it starts with agency. Maybe it's not that simple, but they all are there. and they're all important. And I think I could have also made that graph like 3 parts that have arrows going all directions. Maybe they'll influence one another. I'm not so sure, but what I want to kind of highlight here is I think if we're focusing on these things, we're also thinking about the others. I want to connect that to research. And I'll do that here, sort of indirectly or roundabout. So also want to talk about structure and agency. So this structure and agency is often something that's a dilemma that's sort of talked about in social theory, not only education, but also educational theory, and kind of 3 very simple ways of imagining that here. So how do we imagine that individuals can act in the world amidst all these structures and these pressures of structure that are always there? Often in an oppressive way, but also sometimes they allow affordances. So number 1 is a way to imagine the relationship between agency and structure that I think is, so that in this case, like individual agency or even community agency is totally locked in to structure. So I would think about this as a very kind of deterministic way of imagining structure and agency relationship. I think we do see situations in life where this seems to be what's happening. The people do find themselves in a situation where they have very limited agency. So I don't want to suggest this doesn't happen. I think it does, but I think also as a general way of thinking about it, it's quite deterministic. Whereas number 2 would be pretty much the opposite way of thinking. Is we recognize structure and agency, but we imagine that somehow individuals have this agency that they can exercise totally outside of structure. I don't think many researchers would adopt or accept this view, and I don't either. But I think it does operate kind of definitely in U.S. culture, the idea that individuals kind of act freely or somehow they're totally liberated to do things. But it's very problematic as a way to think about individual action in the world. So number 3 is an effort to kind of capture what I think the way most researchers think about this, some version of this, is that structure and agency are overlapping, intertwined, interlocked, and we can't really think about one without the other. So, I drew those circles how they are because I wanted to fit the words in there, but honestly, this should probably be a lot closer and there should be a lot more overlap. I don't think they're quite right on top of each other because I think we can imagine spaces where they, we can split them apart, but they really are closely interlocked. So what I want to focus about, kind of emphasize here in terms of the question of research and purpose, is that I think a lot of times we spend a lot of energy focusing on this, sort of the structures that shape student lives, international student lives. And I think there's good reason for that because we often bring really necessary and critical perspectives, especially to recognizing and highlighting and helping others try to see oppression in the way oppressive systems and structures work. So we need to do that, and that's important. But I also think it can be very difficult to work only in that space because structures are often oppressive, and it can begin to feel oppressive too for researchers. And I think it can be hard to recognize purpose sometimes because structures change very slowly, if they change at all. And that's very hard to sort of be in that space where the purpose seems to change that, but it's not changing. So I want to kind of promote that we should spend a lot of time in this space too. So thinking about structure, but also always thinking about agency and student agency, international student agency at the same time. So not ignoring structure. I'm not promoting like the number 2 circles there. That's not even reality. But really trying to make sure we complement our focus on structure with attention to agency and maybe even, moving into this space. I'm not quite sure what that space is. And again, it should be a lot smaller, I think. But really kind of be mindful about making a big part of our work focusing on trying to highlight student agency, which is always there, and trying to imagine how that works in relation to structure. Okay, so it's kind of like to connect that to the stuff I said earlier. So I'm imagining that somehow some process like this seems to happen. If we can do this work around agency, goals, purpose for students, I think it sort of makes researchers experience the same kind of thing. And I have an arrow there like it's a cause and effect. I'm not sure that's all there is to it. Maybe the arrow goes both ways. That would be kind of a different question to bring up. And also have this like a clear division. I know this division is not always so simple sometimes, student, researcher. international student researcher. But I think what I've experienced and what I think can happen sometimes is something like this. By doing this work, we also get to experience those things. And so I want to give an example here from my own research where this has happened. So very brief version of a story from a student I worked with called Violet. It's a pseudonym in a research project. So I met Violet when she was starting college, an international student, and I was starting a research project then where I had a cohort of students I was meeting with a few times each academic year to do interviews mainly and talk about how school was going, how their academic experience were, kind of connecting that to other parts of their lives. And I met Violet when in her first semester of college, and she was on a scholarship from her home government, full scholarship, that she worked very hard to get. And she and many other students around the world were on that same scholarship from her home country government. And so the first time we met, she told me about how college was going, the academic stuff, and about her goals and about her dreams and what her plans were. And she also told me that first time we met that there were already some problems with her scholarship, and she had not gotten her stipend that she was supposed to get. She hadn't been able to buy any textbooks that semester. But that wasn't our main focus. I was really trying to learn about who she was and where she was going as a student. So that was my first meeting with Violet. Met with her a few times that year of college, and the third time I met with her, sort of toward the end of her first year of college, she told me that she wasn't ever going to be able to talk to me again because she was going to have to leave the university because she had lost her scholarship and her home government was not paying the scholarships for her, for any of her colleagues in that same situation. And that within a week or two, she would be kicked out of her dorm. And she was devastated. And it was a really devastating conversation to have with her. And she told me about, what she was doing and the agentive steps she was taking to try to figure out what her path would be based on the situation she was in. So this was a moment when maybe I had the circle with the big circle that says structure, the small one that says agency. I mean, Violet seemed to be in that kind of situation right then, where she was doing everything she could, but she was so limited by the structures that were shaping her path right then. So after that conversation, when Violet told me this, she did have to leave the university, and I emailed her a little bit later. I didn't hear back from her, and that was kind of the only contact I had with Violet for a long time. And then several years later, 8 years later, I was kind of finishing up that research project, and I reached out to the students who participated when they were in college, and they were all done with college now. I wanted to see how their lives were going after college. And I reached out to Violet too, and she responded. And I had a conversation with her. And again, 8 years after the last conversations I'd had with her, and she told me about how her life had developed. And after she left college and lost that scholarship, she had some very difficult experiences. She told me she had trouble finding housing at some times. She got married and then she got divorced. So that was part of her story, but really the story she told me was about her agency that she asserted in all those years over her life. So she had gone back to school. She'd gotten a 2-year degree all on her own work and paid for it. She was living in a different state. She had a job she was able to support herself. She was supporting some of her family back home. She was paying to help her grandmother build a home back home in her home country. She was engaged with a really large diaspora community from her country, where she felt really good. And she was planning on how she was going to get her 4-year degree, get a master's degree, get into cybersecurity, which was her goal. So all these wonderful things were happening for Violet because she had sort of found a path for herself, and she was making it happen. So it was because I got to see this long arc of what happened for Violet and the story she told me and she shared with me. It really helped me appreciate how she had been sort of in this situation where she seemed totally locked in for reasons totally beyond her control, and she was able to sort of make a path for herself. And so, like observing that and hearing about that from Violet made me feel like, and observing her purpose and her goals and her agency made me kind of feel like, okay, there's a purpose for me in doing this. There's a goal for me, and it makes me feel like I have agency as a researcher kind of participating in this. And even right now, sharing her story, I feel like there's a purpose to kind of getting this out there. So that was kind of a very quick example of how some of this has happened for me. And I just want to share here too some amazing readings about student agency, a lot about international students, but some more generally, some directly about agency, some less directly. I'm sure some of you know some of these and have others, but these have all been really great for me to think about international students in agency. And just one more quick promotion for my book that just came out recently, where I talk a lot more about Violet's story and the stories of many other students, and really focused on the issue of agency. Okay, 15 minutes. I think that was just right.